Chapter 7. Training to Think Far Beyond the Box. Matan Araz's father was an Israeli diplomat, and Matan lived for part of his youth in Japan. He was closely connected with other Westerners who attended the American school in Japan in the 1980s. At this time, many of the fathers of the students who attended the American school worked for the big American banks and brokerage firms in Tokyo. Word got around that Matan was a computer whiz. One day, he got a call from the father of one of his friends who worked for Morgan Stanley. He needed help coming up with a system that could transfer funds and stock orders quickly across phone lines. Matan, using secure communication lines provided by Morgan Stanley, was able to develop a software program that could transfer money and stock transactions instantly across the world to other Morgan Stanley offices. Now every brokerage firm in the Western world has that technology, but Matan was about 15 years ahead of the rest of the world. He was just 14 years old at the time. He went on to do consulting work for Goldman Sachs in Tokyo. Back in Israel, the army realized that Matan had an enormous amount of experience working in fields needed by the military. Talpiot was quick to accept him and train him further for the army's use. "The most amazing thing about Talpiot," says Matan, "is that the tools you learn to use can really help you make a 1% difference in the battlefield. Think about that, a 1% difference. An infantryman can't make a 1% difference. Maybe a pilot in a small engagement concerning a major target can make that kind of difference, but Talpiots are doing it constantly, day by day, on many different projects. In many ways, we can be the difference between life and death for hundreds or even thousands of people." To make a contribution like that, you first have to be confident that you can, and that it's a possible thing to do, even if certain tasks seem impossible. "You can do anything" is instilled in Talpiot recruits, and if you can't do it, chuckles Matan, you know that another Talpiot graduate either has or is on the verge of doing it. Nothing is impossible. Talpiots are taught from the first day of induction that they can do anything they put their minds to. How does the program inject the cadets with such confidence? Ra'anan Geffen was an early Talpiot graduate from the 3rd class, inducted into the IDF in 1981. Talpiot instills you with a confidence you won't find anywhere else, but you still have to define yourself, he says. Part of that is through actual field work, but the building blocks are being laid when you're doing difficult but important coursework. Even if you don't understand it immediately, the material is taught in a practical manner, allowing even the trailers to understand it. Maybe a little later, but regardless they get it, and that gives you a high level of confidence. Graduates are sometimes given multi-million-dollar budgets in the first months of their research and development tours of duty to create and improve the IDF's weapons arsenal. This vast amount of responsibility and the help they're given from more experienced designers and programmers often puts them in a position where they'll have at least some success. And the more success they have, the more they believe in themselves. They're also taught from day one that if they don't have the answer, being in Talpiot gives them a rare advantage. They will be within 1 or 2 degrees of finding another Talpiot graduate that does know the answer to the problem they're working on, or at least has answers that could lead to a solution. Talpiot was not meant to be a machine that churns out like-minded thinkers. The founders envisioned a program that would give their cadets a foundation to do whatever they wanted to do. The program was designed to breed creativity, not conformity. And no 2 Talpiots come out of the program the same. The program has a long life influence on the graduates who have gone on to do many different but equally mind-boggling things. Talpiot is also geared to help force recruits to work and think both within a system and outside of that system. It also strives to provide cadets with the ability to lead, as many graduates will be managing and working closely with some of Israel's most inventive engineers, avionics experts, computer programmers, and intelligence analysts. One way of training a student to think is to play against his strengths, says one insider. Don't let him rely on methods of learning or problem solving he's already used to. If you force that person to learn in different ways, you're forcing him to think a different way. Tools used to find a student's hidden potential include an overload of training, forcing students to work and study together, and pairing Talpiot with current and former class commanders. Other key factors in the future success of its graduates in and out of the Israeli military-industrial complex are informal instruction in time management and Talpiot's proficiency in developing the student's ability to distinguish what's important from what isn't to achieve a given objective. Talpiots are given access to something most soldiers don't have until they're older and more experienced: information about how things work. In the broader military, a soldier is a soldier, and he operates in a need-to-know environment. The goal of Talpiot is to expand students' knowledge so they're more in the loop about what happens behind that green curtain separating commanders from the men and women who rank below them. The refining of that great foundation came in large part from a man who once headed Mafat, General Yitzhak ben Israel. He was born in Israel in 1949, toward the end of the War of Independence. Had Talpiot been an option for him when he was 18, he would have been a perfect candidate. General Ben Israel has the intellect of a rocket scientist, the brawn of a special forces commander, and the confidence of a true military leader. His studies focused on mathematics and physics and philosophy for fun. In essence, he was a Talpiot before Talpiot existed. His resume is that of a true unsung hero, a man who spent his life in the army without being noticed by the public at large. Ben Israel joined the Israeli Air Force right after the Six-Day War in 1967. Before taking leadership of Mafat, he held high-level positions in the intelligence and weapons development units of the IDF. He was in charge of the Israeli Air Force's Operations Research Branch. He has won Israel's prestigious Security Award twice for developing still classified security systems. The first time Yitzhak ben Israel won the prize was in 1972, when he was just 23, making him one of the youngest recipients ever. People familiar with the first awarding of the prize say it had to do with developing an improved weapons delivery system for Israel's fleet of fighter jets. The second time was in 2001. This award is even more clouded in secrecy than the first, but it reportedly had to do with his work on a major project involving the concept of fighting future wars. One official at Israel's Ministry of Defense, who could not be named for security reasons, said, "What General Ben Israel developed is still one of the main secrets we have in our arsenal." He also led the Analysis and Assessment Division of IDF Intelligence. In this position, it was his job to analyze how the enemy was thinking. In order to do that, he tried to think like them, putting himself in the shoes of Syrian, Egyptian, Jordanian, Iraqi, Lebanese, and later Iranian leadership. He used these lessons often when heading Mafat. During that period, he was also in charge of the Talpiot program. General Ben Israel would often refer to his work in intelligence in his bid to get Talpiot cadets to outthink their foreign enemies outside as well as their peers in other army units. Coursework, lesson planning, special lectures, and army service were redesigned with this goal in mind. In order to accomplish as much as Yitzhak ben Israel has, you need to think a little differently from your peer group and much differently from the average citizen of the world. And General Ben Israel has worked tirelessly to help Talpiot cadets see into a corner of his mind so they can get exposure to the kind of thinking that has propelled the Israeli Defense Forces so far ahead of the nation's enemies in technology of warfare. Every few years, General Ben Israel takes time away from teaching at Tel Aviv University, where he heads the Tel Aviv University Workshop for Science and Technology Security, to lead current and former Talpiots on a week-long creativity sabbatical, where they can bond, share stories and information, and sharpen their creative skills. During one of these sabbaticals, the group of young men and women from several Talpiot classes, some still active, some in reserves, were driven into the Negev and dropped off at an old Air Force camp. They were split into groups and told to come up with an idea of something they'd like to create, something that could be done in a week. The needed materials would be provided. One team came up with a car deodorant that has the smell of a new car. The team was able to analyze the chemical compounds of that new car smell and reproduce it in a spray. Another team came up with a way to engineer a small box that could be dropped into the water tank of a toilet to cancel the sound of the flushing. General Ben Israel's hulking figure watched over the demonstration of this invention. He asked the young Talpiots why they'd spent their time working on something like that, and they replied that sometimes they phone their friends while in the bathroom, but it doesn't have to be obvious. The general is gratified when the young men and women he's working with approach problems from an entirely new angle. He says, "We do a lot of activities like this to help encourage people in Talpiot to think in a creative, out-of-the-box way." General Ben Israel spent his career in the military thinking out of the box. After the Yom Kippur War, he helped reanalyze crucial data. He still uses the lessons he learned to teach and demonstrate his different way of thinking. For instance, before the Yom Kippur War, the intelligence community looked primarily for evidence to support their conjecture that the Syrian and Egyptian armies were merely carrying out exercise maneuvers, which was precisely what the Arab military wanted them to think. Ben Israel recalls, "Yet, from time to time, there were pieces of information that refuted this conjecture. For example, a few days before the war, the Soviet Union put the families of Soviet advisors in Egypt and Syria on a special chartered airplane and flew them back to Moscow. You don't do this if the army is merely carrying out an exercise. But the chief of Israeli intelligence said, "Okay, I have so much information which supports and corroborates the exercise conjecture, and I have only a few that negate it. Therefore, I think the most probable one is the exercise conjecture. My method is not to look for supporting evidence. I look for refuting evidence. If he had adopted my model, he would have seen two possible conjectures here, exercise or war. We had strong refuting evidence against the exercise conjecture, the Russian families leaving the possible theatre of war en masse. This should have rung serious alarm bells." In 1973, if the intelligence community, and especially the Mossad, had thought about refuting evidence more, they would have simply followed up to see that the Arab armies had indeed carried out the exercises they'd supposedly been assigned. They would have immediately found out that neither Egypt nor Syria ever actually completed the exercises. It was all part of a misinformation campaign. The Egyptians would send telegrams saying this unit should do that exercise, this unit should do that, knowing we'd intercept their communications. But we never checked to see that the armies were in fact ignoring the telegrams. That was a fatal mistake. In addition to giving credence to the conjecture that they were preparing for war, there easily could have been a third option. There might be fighting of some sort, but it might not be a full-scale war. No one thought of that either. Ben Israel used his refuting evidence model and was proven correct. He concluded, same facts, different ways of looking at them. Though former intelligence officers often get behind the times, General Ben Israel's legendary, unique way of thinking brings Israel's intelligence agencies back to him unofficially even today. In late 2011, he had been analysing the Arab Spring. We collect a lot of data on what's happening around us. Sometimes we know facts, sometimes we think we know, then find different opinions. Sometimes we have what we believe are facts that later turn out to be not true. What is the relation between what you know or think you know and the decisions that you have to make? To make a decision, you have to estimate what will come out of that decision. For instance, take the Arab Spring. You read a lot about it. You see stories on television. You send your agents to these countries that are in the midst of revolution or to countries that could be the next to see revolution. You monitor it. You gather a lot of information. But what should we do about it? To answer that question, you have to assess what will possibly happen with this Arab Spring. Will you get democracy? Perhaps you'll get a takeover by the Muslim Brotherhood. Will these countries go back to how they were after a year or two of revolution? You need to weigh all of the possible ways the situation could develop. Some people believe that if you study it long enough, you may calculate what will happen. But I don't think so. There is no way on earth to judge what will happen in the future. It is a logical problem. Here is a simple example. You see one white swan, then a second, third, fourth, fifth and sixth. You still can't conclude that all swans are white. It's impossible logically. Once you realize it is illogical, what will you do? Psychologically, we were built to trust past experience in similar situations. But if we can't do that, how should we handle ourselves in the world? I think there is a way, though it is not in our nature. Nature built us to be inductive, to make generalizations from past experience. If you put your hand in a fire and feel the heat, you will never put your hand in a fire again. But perhaps the pain you felt in your hand might not be caused by the fire. If you were a scientist, You might check your facts by putting the hand in from a different angle or putting the other hand in the fire. You do all sorts of tests. This standard way of scientific thinking can be limited and destructive, even deadly, in the world of intelligence. For Talpiot recruits going into research and development or into intelligence units, as many have done, it's crucial to drop that way of thinking. Thinking out of the box does not preclude learning from past mistakes, and this quality is a badge of honor to General Ben Israel. During his time as head of Mafat and as the de facto head of Talpiot, he really pushed this point. To this day, when he lectures to a Talpiot class, he tells stories of past mistakes and tries to get the cadets to understand his way of thinking so that they can learn to think differently from the way that most of us are programmed by nature. That's a key training tool, not just for students going through a program, but for young men and women going through life. Amir Shlachet, who moved on from Talpiot to major positions in the banking world, uses Ben Israel's kind of thinking to solve problems in his work. Though it may not be common for most people, Shlachet suspects that there's usually something inside a Talpiot that gives him the ability to think differently. One of the strengths of Talpiot recruits is that they are multidisciplinary by nature. Oh, and we're continuously curious. And as any teacher will tell you, the best student is often a curious student. Chapter 8. Reality Check. If academics are the backbone of Talpiot training, the central nervous system is the experience the cadets get going from unit to unit. In each unit-to-unit visit, the goal is to take the theoretical lessons students learned back in the classroom at Hebrew University and apply them to real field exercises and battle situations. When the Talpiot program started, the military was adamant on one point. The students had to be part of the IDF. Its early leaders knew that if the program were to be a success, the young cadets would have to see the problems faced by their brothers and sisters in the rest of the IDF so that they could come up with creative ways to help them and to advance the way the IDF works and fights on all levels. Students who had made it into the program soon began visiting the different units of the Army, Navy and Air Force to give them a feel for what happens in the field beyond the classroom. But because Talpiot was still a secret, and because of rivalries and suspicion throughout the various ranks, it was difficult to successfully integrate Talpiot students into the rest of the army. Initially, the unit-to-unit visits were haphazard and disorganized. As there hadn't been much time from the moment Talpiot was approved to the actual start of the program, there was little chance to get the word out to field commanders whose help would be crucial. There would be a lot of hurry up and wait, boarding buses, then waiting outside checkpoints. Wherever the Talpiot students arrived, accommodations and meals were arranged at the last second. Even acquiring ammunition for various Talpiot training sessions was difficult. Though there were exceptions, the students were usually not made to feel particularly welcome. The Navy intelligence and technology units, however, were very different. Officers there were often more broadly educated. And though the Navy was important, it was not seen as a unit with the history and glory of the tank units, paratroopers and the Air Force. Many of the early Talpiot recruits were given high-level access to problems faced by Israeli naval officers, and they were granted green lights to try to help. Several Talpiot recruits from the first three classes later performed extensive service in the Navy. Ofir Shoham was recruited to Talpiot's second class in 1980. He was a rough-and-tumble, serious student and soldier. A favourite among his Talpiot peers, they credit Shoham with bringing their group together. He quickly became a legend during basic training with his fellow Talpiot classmates. A young recruit from a paratrooper unit was giving a Talpiot student a tough time. After a few minutes, the much shorter Shoham walked up to the 18-year-old bully and told the guy, "Go shove off, find someone else to pick on." The recruit refused and pushed him. But Shoham had already excelled in extensive pre-military martial arts training, and the next thing everyone knew, the bully went flying through the air. He wound up with a broken leg and was subsequently dismissed from the paratroopers because he could not complete the training. In fact, in those early years, many in Talpiot felt bullied and abused, not just by other soldiers, but by field training commanders as well. Later, a special investigative panel sent by the Ministry of Defense would agree. As Talpiot matured, a war was raging to Israel's north in Lebanon. Years of terrorist attacks on Israelis directed by the Palestine Liberation Organization and other terrorist groups angered the Israeli government, led at that time by Prime Minister Menachem Begin. These groups had virtually taken over Beirut and other parts of Lebanon during a power grab in Lebanon's civil war, which began in 1975. Two attacks in particular were so outrageous the Israeli government felt there was no choice but to respond. First, there was the hijacking of a bus by terrorists who had infiltrated northern Israel through the Lebanese border. That attack resulted in the murder of 38 Israeli civilians, including 13 children. Then there was the attempted assassination of Israel's ambassador in London, Shlomo Argov. The shooting left the ambassador in a coma for months. Though he survived, he was paralyzed and later lost his eyesight. The war in Lebanon quickly became controversial in Israel, as many citizens felt Israel had entered into a full-scale war that had been avoidable. Many argued that there were other ways of defeating the wave of terror cascading from Lebanon. For better or worse, war often leads to innovation, and in this case, bright Talpiot students and Israel's military research and development arm were there to take advantage of the opportunity the war brought them. Lebanon became a military training ground for some early members of Talpiot. They were able to witness war from the front lines, seeing which weapons worked, which caused problems, which systems needed remodeling. The Israeli military machine needed to come up with new ways of fighting, and Talpiot was there to help. One system born in the war would later become known as the Trophy. It is a tank-mounted anti-rocket device that is now in service on Israel's fleet of Merkava tanks. It automatically fires a projectile at an incoming anti-tank rocket to disable and misdirect the projectile, saving the lives of the tank crew inside. Talpiot students and a few of their instructors would become instrumental in making the Trophy operational. As the controversial war settled into a controversial Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, Talpiot's unit-to-unit program began to take form in more concrete and institutionalized ways. The Army, Air Force and Naval units started to come to the understanding that the Talpiot program was here to stay, that it was not a unit for spoiled nerds, and that the students of Talpiot were indeed there to help them and future IDF fighters. They became more and more forthright in explaining their problems, their successes and their failures, and most of all, outlining how and where they needed help. Cooperation and special training for Talpiot cadets became more encouraged and more accepted. Eventually, a very specific and organized program was devised to help give Talpiot cadets a real taste of what life was like in the skies, over Israel, in warplanes, in the hangars where the planes were fueled and repaired, in the trenches with the Green Army in tanks, armored personnel carriers, in the troop carriers that ferry paratroopers to their drop zones, on ships at sea, and even sometimes in actual war zones. The training sessions with fighting units started to build connections between Talpiot and those units. Talpiot cadets would actually do the work of their fellow soldiers in the field. They didn't just learn about changing tire treads on tanks, they changed them. They didn't just learn about tank-mounted weaponry, they actually got into the tanks, drove them through obstacles, identified targets and fired. They flew in fighter jet simulators, they fired machine guns and artillery. They dropped off explosives with IDF engineer teams, and they jumped out of airplanes with the paratroopers. They sailed on the sea with naval commanders and went underwater in Israel's submarines. Soon, the ordinary soldiers and officers in those units started to do review training with their Talpiot colleagues. They wanted more time to explain their challenges in the hope that Talpiot research would help them and their units down the line. Ophir Kraoz spent some time in the United States while his father was an executive working in Georgia. He was inducted into Talpiot's 13th class in 1991, soon after Iraq attacked Israel with volleys of Scud missiles. He believes that going from unit to unit helps Talpiot cadets draw closer to the rest of the Israeli Defense Forces. After you lift a 45-kilogram shell and you smash it on your hands and move it around, you can say, "Okay, that's very heavy," he says. Then you say, "Let's try to make them lighter, but with the same power." It's beneficial to see the problems on the ground. Though you're only 18, you see so many parts of the military, you're really getting more information than most generals. They only get to see what's under their command. Most generals may be an expert on one thing and have their own department, but they never get this perspective of the army. Spending time in so many units later allows a Talpiot graduate to think more seamlessly, Kraoz notes. Almost all of the projects are integrated, and that's a great advantage. Compare this to someone who studied something at university and went on to a company with a very specific focus. They get more and more specific as their careers go on. Although we, Talpiot cadets, come from math, physics and computer science backgrounds, we need to see how to implement the theoretical into real systems and real products which help the end user, in this case the soldier, but in an integrated way. For instance, take Iron Dome, an anti-missile system that targets short-range and medium-sized rockets. It was developed in part by Talpiot graduates from an idea of a Talpiot cadet. You need new technology and you need it really fast. It's a mix of at least 5 to 10 different technologies. You have the missiles and the ballistics, but you need the software to know that this missile isn't going to hit a populated area. Seeing as much as we saw in the army really helped us understand how everything comes together and how everything is connected. Saar Cohen, a graduate of Talpiot's 15th class in 1996, agrees that it was instructive to see the diverse needs of the military machine and the different technologies that keep it moving. That was what I was most interested in from the start. I wanted to hear about military technology, and they were pretty open about it, with the hope that we would have ideas to make it better, more sophisticated, more protective, and easier to use. By the time I was in Talpiot, they encouraged us to do a lot. Cohen was also drawn to the camaraderie in the different units. All units have their own sort of code, and this was fascinating to me. And more importantly, it makes you directly think about why you are working so hard. There are real people out there, and to some extent, just as we're depending on them to hit their targets, they're depending on us to break enemy code, to come up with better intelligence, to reconfigure weapons, and to use physics to give them a greater edge in the field. It really hits you when you're out there. You're exposed to life and death situations and military secrets at a very young age. It's sobering to see things at that level as an 18 or 19-year-old. It quickly makes you realize just how important a part of the machine you really are. Teamwork was another lesson Cohen learned from the army. About working on software programs while in the military, he comments, "In most cases, you work in a team. There is nobody looking directly over your shoulder when writing code, but there are managers and supervisors like anywhere else. Despite less supervision than in the corporate world, you have a serious amount of pressure in this kind of environment. But you always have someone to seek out and talk to for advice. Most importantly, people are always helpful on your team. It's a mission. Everything you do, every program you work on is a mission, and we all view it that way." Today, the length of the unit-to-unit training session varies from 2 days to 2 weeks, depending on the branch, the complexity of the unit's work, and how much help the unit might need in the future, according to research and development planners at the Ministry of Defense. Almost every section of the Israel Defense Forces will host Talpiot students in the weeks when they're not studying. There is no summer break for Talpiot. Most of the cadets will tell you that going from unit to unit is one of their favorite parts of the entire Talpiot experience.